Good morning. Kind of an encouraging word there before I get up and speak. I'm sure you're wondering what this is about. But I've got a question for you. An amazing turn of events, I know, that I would have a question. How could it be? But bear with me one more time. Why do we forget? That's the question. All of us, almost all the time. Why do we forget? Now, I confess I didn't come up with this one. Not at first, at least. In fact, it was one of you who will go unnamed who walked into my office and said, "Why do we forget?" Actually said, "Why do I forget?" He was in obvious distress, so I urged him, I resisted the urge to say, "Why do we eat? Why do we sleep?" Good thing, too, because when he finally sat down and told me his story, I wound up being as distressed as he was. Bottom line, he had forgotten a very important event in the life of his family, an event that had shaped him, helped him. It was something that he was thankful for a few years ago. But now that he was off to college and doing other things, this thing just passed him by. And he was sad about it, perplexed about it, and wondering what gives. "Why are we so stupid?" he said, pointing the finger at himself. "Why do we forget?" And by the time he left my office, he had me almost as perplexed as he was, maybe even more. Because he's right, is he not? And it happens all the time, all the time. Someone goes out of the way to help us across the street, and then we go on our way, acting as if nothing happened. A teacher reaches out to us at a time when we're lost, and we pretty much quickly take it for granted. A friend gives us an entire evening sharing their time with us, sharing their life, actually, and we shrug our shoulders, or even worse, wonder about their motives. Or someone dies for our sins, and we just keep on sinning. Why is that, anyway? I'm serious, as you can tell, much too serious, probably, given this moment in our lives. You know, here we are in November with the trees finally starting to lose their leaves, and all of us pretty much losing our minds, given the tests and papers and projects without end that are staring us in the face. And then this turkey gets up in chapel and asks, "Why do we forget? Why do we remember? How can we remember, given all that's happening right now?" So sit down, shut up, I need some relief. Yeah, me too. But this isn't my fault, remember. One of you asked me the question in the first place. But worse than that, not too many days after I got this impossible question from one of you, I found myself in Boston trying to get 100 things done so I could get back here and do 100 other things, when all of a sudden I noticed this elderly fellow with great difficulty trying to walk across the street. He was not just old, by the way. He was also pretty frail for whatever reason, which means getting across the street wasn't easy. And so with one hand, he was using a cane, and with the other, he was mostly kind of waving in the air, trying to keep his balance, perhaps, but maybe he was waving for help. Who knows? Anyway, I'm one of those observer types in such situations, which means that instead of offering help, I just kind of looked at him, wondering what was going on and whether he could actually get across the street before the light turned green, which, of course, would give Boston drivers an opportunity to run over him. Anyway, eventually it dawned on me that perhaps I should intervene. I am a Christian, after all, one of only 2 or 3 in Boston that day, or so it seemed. So I rushed up beside him, held up his waving hand, and pretty much kind of carried him across the street. It was kind of fun, actually, once I got going. But then an interesting thing happened when we got to the sidewalk on the other side of the street. The man didn't say a word, didn't even look at me, in fact. He just put his cane to the ground and began scooting along to wherever he was going. I stood there, of course, kind of watching him, wondering at first if he was going to fall, but eventually wondering, what just happened? I mean, didn't I do the fellow a favor? Didn't I deserve at least a smile, if not a thank you? A nod, perhaps? Or even just a grunt? Apparently not, because the fellow just kept walking. Of course, I thought to myself, I am in Boston. We are not overly mannerly in this neck of the woods. But still, I mean, the fellow was about to get run over, for heaven's sake, and yet from him came nothing. And so I went on my way, shaking my head and wondering about people, about life, and then all of a sudden looking up and seeing something that I'd never had seen in quite the same way before. It was a parent holding on to the hand of a small child, helping the child walk across another Boston street, and the child pretty much complaining every step of the way. And of course, I've seen that scene a million times in my life as well. We all have. But what hit me at that moment was how similar it was to the experience that I had 2 minutes before with someone on the other end of the age spectrum. Young or old, we don't seem to get it. We start out forgetting what we've been given, and we end up that way as well. That sure has been true with me, I must confess. I didn't see myself in the elderly fellow I helped across the street because, of course, I'm so young. But in the child complaining about his predicament, I saw myself in droves. I had one of the most privileged upbringings of anyone I've ever known. Parents who loved me without exception, an extended family of cousins and aunts and grandparents that not only endured me, but pretty much loved me as if they were my own parents. I had friends galore, went through an amazing school system where teachers put up with my lazy study habits, yanking me from grade to grade. And my parents were pretty wealthy by the standards of those days. We had a large home, swimming pool. I got a car the day I turned 16, and a totally free college education wherever I wanted to go. I mean, I had the world, and I hardly noticed. Oh, I'd be excited about a gift for a day or two, but not too long after that, I'd noticed that it didn't quite measure up to the gift that someone else had, or wasn't getting me where I really wanted to go, wherever that might be. In other words, in nearly every case, the gift was almost immediately taken for granted, replaced by something I didn't yet have, something I now wanted, something that would surely make me happy when I got it. Not. I mean, it never works for long, right? Ever. So why then are we so stupid? Why in the first place, if we think these things we want are so important, why aren't we more thankful for them when we actually get them? But even more perplexing, why then when we are given them and they don't satisfy, do we go right back out there and want something else, which we assume will finally make us happy, even though the thing didn't work last time? Is that dumb or what? And yet, we do it over and over again. What gives? I had that same thought, by the way, when I was reading Ezekiel chapter 20 a few weeks ago, the one we read at the beginning of our service this morning, of course, where the Lord recounts time after time when he rescued the Israelites from Egypt, from the wilderness, from the hands of enemies who would try to destroy them, giving them instead their daily bread, parting the seas so they could walk through, toppling the walls of Jericho so they could have a land of their own, overflowing with milk and honey. You all know the story. You've read it so many times, you probably know it by heart. It is our story, of course, our collective history, you might say, as Christians certainly, but as human beings. We are those who have been given all manner of things that we desperately wanted at the time we were given them, and then just as quickly pretty much got bored with the gifts. What we remember, what easily comes to mind for us, is what we don't have. What we forget, what we seem incapable of remembering, is what we have already been given. So why do we do it? Particularly those of us who are followers of Christ, who week after week or month after month share the meal that reminds us of what we have been given. Some of us call it Eucharist, others communion. Some of us take the bread as it passes us by, others go forward to take the cup. But regardless of how we do it, there we are, regularly, routinely, being reminded of what Christ did for us on the cross, what it cost him, and what it means for us miserable sinners now saved by grace through the one who didn't sin. And then, what do? Well, we walk out the door and say, wow, it's cold today, or hot, or whatever, and start talking about the fellow in front of us who kept falling asleep, or talking, or texting, or whatever, and then laugh and ask, where should we eat? Totally forgetting what we have already eaten in church just a few minutes before. Food we didn't deserve. Food that ought to nourish us forever. What's wrong with us? What's wrong with us? I don't know. And that's the most honest answer that I can give you, by the way. I mean, at one level I know, and so do you, I suspect. But when I dig a little deeper into the reasoning and the facts behind it, the thing just becomes more and more mysterious. I mean, I was one of the blessed ones. There's nothing in my background that should have made me anything but grateful for all I'd been given, especially since I was part of the first generation in my own family to be so blessed. My family on both sides were Mennonites, as some of you know. And like most other Christians, their journey was not an easy one. Though I wasn't a pacifist, most Mennonites are, and that fact made life pretty difficult for them. That plus the fact that they were very often successful farmers. If you're impoverished, no one cares if you won't join the war. But if you're doing well, enjoying the harvest while all the others are sent overseas dying for their country, well, that's a problem. And as a result, they wound up moving all over Europe trying to find a safe place to live, where they could live according to what they believed and live in peace. That eventually led some of them to North America in the 19th century, and my grandparents to California in the 20th. That didn't turn out so well, however, since a few years after they arrived, the Great Depression hit, and they to a large extent lost their shirts at that time. My parents' generation, as a result, was raised during the Depression and came to adulthood during the Second World War. And that war, as you know, was a tough one. Everyone was engaged in one way or another. And almost everyone knew family or friends who'd lost their lives in the process. But eventually, the war ended, and we came into a period of time quite like anything in American history. It wasn't all good or easy, to be sure. There was the Korean War and the Vietnam War. But eventually, things got a little bit better. We had the civil rights issues. We had problems of poverty. But we came into a season where a large percentage of time, for a large percentage of Americans over a period of time, were very prosperous. Very prosperous. And that was true for my family as well. And unlike my forebears, I grew up not in a time of persecution, but floating in a sea of goodies, which I quickly took for granted. I heard from my parents about how things used to be, but what they described was nothing like what I experienced. Life was good. We ate well. We lived well. And even more importantly, I received a wonderful education, both at school and at church. I learned about my faith. I embraced it eventually, and even thought of myself as sort of theologically astute. I had it all, in other words. And yet, And yet, it took an accident, as you know, a horrible event which took the life of my cousin, to bring me to my knees and at least begin to teach me what I should have known all along. And why was that, to get back to the question? Why would the blessed one, the one with so many advantages and all the knowledge, be the one who didn't get it, didn't remember, in the words we're using? Of all the people, why would he, me, be the one to forget? I think that's what's going on around the world right now, by the way. And it's also what seems to me to be happening in Ezekiel, of which we read a small portion a few minutes ago. And of course, there are similar passages all through the Bible, beginning to end. It's everywhere. And essentially, it is the Lord, through his prophets, complaining about the simple fact that almost every time he answers our prayers and gives us what we want, whether it's freedom from our captors or manna from heaven or healing from sickness, we pretty much quickly ignore the one who gave it to us in the first place and make idols of the thing that he gave us. In other words, we forget the giver and become totally glued to the things given and want more of those things, even when they don't satisfy. And the question being asked by Ezekiel, and the question we're asking as well this morning, is how can it be? How can it be, my people, that you, to whom I've given so much, would forget? How can it be? This summer, I got some unexpected insight on that question from a very unexpected source. On Father's Day, my wife gave me a present, even though I'm not her father, and it turned out to be the exact same thing that 2 days later a friend would talk with me about and also give me a copy of. It's a book called Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. I don't know how many of you might have read it. She's the author of Seabiscuit, which I loved in both book form and movie form. So that's probably why Judy gave it to me. But my friend was convinced that I would enjoy it as well, which I did. Though enjoy is not quite the right word here. It's actually one of the hardest books I've ever read, because it's about this fellow named Louis Zamperini, who, after a short, successful career as a track superstar, was drafted into the Army Air Corps, where he became a pilot in World War II. His plane was shot down, unfortunately, and to condense 300 or 400 pages into one sentence, he endured days and days on the ocean before being rescued, and then months and months in a POW camp after that. It's horrific what human beings can do to one another, by the way, especially when you've got war as an excuse. And in this book, we see Louis and his friends going through the most awful stuff. But then, amazingly, the war ends and he returns home. One of only a few to survive the ordeal, it turns out. And Louis is feted by his family, he's promoted by the press, and marries a wonderful person who loves him, even though probably she shouldn't. Why? Because when Louis comes home, he pretty soon becomes an alcoholic. He can't stop drinking, in fact, and comes very close to throwing away the life which had been miraculously preserved through the very worst of times. And the question that hits you as you're reading this book is why? Why would he do such a thing? And the answer is that he can't shake what he endured during the war. The pain of it, and the people who looked him in the eyes and repeatedly tortured him remains ever in his mind. And to drown them out, he starts drinking and runs away. Until one day, his good wife coaxes him, almost against his will, to attend some small meeting in downtown LA where this guy, Billy Graham, was going to speak. At a time, by the way, when nobody knew who Billy Graham was. This was very early on. And there, through another miracle, he met Christ. The real Christ, you might say. The one who bore his sin and nailed it to the cross and threw it away forever. And Louis walked away from that service and he never drank again. Why? Because he didn't need to. Suddenly, he had nothing from which he needed to escape. The horrific dreams and memories that he had about his time as a POW were gone. Not because they didn't happen. They did. But because for the first time, he could look those memories square in the face, as well as those who perpetrated them, and he could forgive them. He could love them. He didn't need to pay them back, in other words, because now he could pass along to them the same grace that he had received and not deserved. And of course, the reason this story hit me so hard, and probably why people gave it to me and gave me the book in the first place, is that that's exactly what happened to me after my accident. It wasn't the pain of the accident, remember, that turned me around. After the accident and learning about my passenger's death, I went to hell, literally. It was awful. What turned me around and why I learned wasn't the pain I experienced, it was the grace. In particular, my passenger's parents, my aunt and uncle, who came to me with the grace of Christ and told me they loved me. "You're our son now too, you know," was the way they said it. And that's what made the difference. That's what reminded me of that which I already knew, but didn't know, really. So here's the deal then, as far as I can figure it out, regarding this quandary of God's generosity and our forgiveness. Good times deserve our gratitude and thankfulness. They really do. When we're given gifts, we should enjoy them as well as the one who gave them to us in the first place. But that's not what we tend to do. We do the wrong thing, the unjust thing, you might say, which is why we live in a world that is full of injustice, horrific abuse, pain, and suffering like you can't imagine. And you would think that all this suffering would teach us something, especially when we're on the receiving end of the deal. You know, if we can't remember to be thankful in good times, surely we would remember when we see how awful life can be when we're not grateful, when we or others are victims of ingratitude. But interestingly, that doesn't do it either. Didn't do it for me, I can tell you that. And it didn't do it for Louis Zamperini either. We learn through the tough times, to be sure. We may become realists when disaster hits, but we do not become grateful, as far as I can tell, or even doers of justice necessarily. In good times or in bad, we somehow manage to forget the gift, forget the giver. There are lots of reasons why Jesus came, of course, and you know me. If you know me, you know that one of my pet peeves, something that bugs me beyond measure, is when people reduce the work of Christ to a single dimension. What would Jesus do can produce some interesting speculation, but that's not my cup of tea. Most of the time, we need to think bigger about Christ, not smaller. But you'll grant me this one exception this morning, if I confess that there is one thing that strikes me about Jesus more than anything else. He is the one and only one who taught me how to remember. Actually, in one sense, his 3-year journey on earth could be summarized as a call to remember, since he repeatedly reminded his closest friends and his sharpest critics not to forget. Not to forget the law, for one thing, but not to forget its actual meaning either. And he did that through stories and questions and parables without end. And he did it through his life, whether calming the seas to the amazement of his disciples, who didn't get it, or healing the woman who merely touched the hem of his garment and did. But of course, his greatest lesson on remembrance came at the cross. He would begin that lesson at the Last Supper when he told his befuddled disciples, "Do this in remembrance of me." He would continue it into the garden where he would sweat drops of blood thinking about what was to come. He would make it stick as he journeyed to the cross, his disciples now having pretty much deserted him and his task staring him in the face. And he would complete the lesson uttering those amazing words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Acknowledging not only our stupidity, but our fallenness and its impact on our memory. And then dying for us, for those who didn't remember, the one person who never forgot, taking the place of those who couldn't remember. And in that moment called grace, accomplished everything. Our justification, to be sure, but with it not only the one way to remember, to finally remember, but the one way to finally forget that which keeps us from remembering in the first place. You see, what was it that kept Louis Zamperini from enjoying the good life and good gifts he was given after he was freed from prison in World War II? It was the faces of those who had beaten him senseless in the prison camp, still consuming his memory, still popping up in his nightmares, and still requiring some kind of retribution. He needed to murder them, to pay them back for what they had done to him. But then he met Christ on the cross and saw the one whom he had sent there, saw him who didn't sin, forgiving him who did. And then hearing the words I heard lying in a hospital a few years later. I love you, Louis, Stan, Mary, Martha. You're my son now too, you know, my daughter, my child. And in a moment, he knew the meaning of forgiveness, of grace, and like that, his need for retribution was gone. The memory of his tormentors was finally history. And in its place, all that he had been given by the one who actually gave it to him. Louis is 94 years old, by the way, still living, still remembering and living gratefully what the rest of us so easily forget. You want a good memory? Full of that which you have been given and don't deserve, and free of that which you do? Come to the table, eat, drink, and listen. Really listen to the one who calls you to sup with him. This is my body, broken for you, he says. Do this in remembrance of me. You'll never be hungry again. Thanks be to God.